The iron chains around Soraya Vell's wrists had rubbed her skin raw during the 3-day journey from the mining colonies to Zareth Prime's capital. She sat in the transport's cargo hold, surrounded by other condemned prisoners, thieves, rebels, and those unfortunate enough to have offended the wrong noble. Unlike the others who wept or raged against their fate, Soraya remained silent, her dark eyes fixed on the small viewport that showed the approaching city. Zareth Prime sprawled across the planet's surface like a metallic cancer, its towering spires reaching toward the blood-red sky. The great arena sat at the city's heart, a massive coliseum that could house 500,000 spectators. From orbit, it looked like a gaping wound in the urban landscape, which, Soraya thought grimly, was exactly what it was. First time seeing the capital, slave? Sneered Kex Thorne, a scarred smuggler who'd been caught running contraband through Imperial space. Enjoy the view. It'll be your last. Soraya didn't respond. She'd learned long ago that silence was often the best defense against cruelty. On the mining world, where she'd spent her 18 years, the overseers had called her the quiet one, never causing trouble, never drawing attention. But that same silence had damned her, and Imperial Inquisitor Malachar arrived, searching for those with alien contamination in their bloodlines. The transport shuddered as it entered the atmosphere. Through the viewport, Soraya could see the arena growing larger, its black stone walls carved with scenes of past executions. Propaganda broadcasts played on screens throughout the hold, showing previous arena spectacles, men and women torn apart by genetically modified beasts while crowds cheered. Citizens of Zareth Prime, announced the smooth voice of the Empire's primary broadcaster. Tomorrow's exhibition promises to be exceptional. Among the condemned, we have Soraya Vell, a slave girl whose genetic testing revealed traces of the Forbidden's Nephilim bloodline. Watch as the arena cleanses our empire of this alien filth. The other prisoners turned to stare at her. Nephilim ancestry was considered the worst possible crime. These ancient beings had once challenged the Empire's dominance before being wiped out centuries ago. Even a trace of their genetic markers meant immediate execution. Nephilim? Kex whispered, backing away. You're one of those demon spawn? Soraya finally spoke, her voice steady despite the fear churning in her stomach. I'm just a girl who worked the mines. Whatever's in my blood, I never asked for it. The transport began its descent toward the arena's landing platforms. Guards in black armor waited below, their weapons gleaming in the artificial light. Soraya closed her eyes and tried to remember her mother's face, a woman who died in the mines when Soraya was 12, taking whatever secrets she'd harbored about their family's true heritage to her grave dot. As the transport touched down, the cargo doors hissed open. Imperial guards stormed in, yanking prisoners to their feet with unnecessary brutality. When they reached Soraya, the lead guard paused, studying her face. So you're the one, he said, his voice distorted by his helmets. Speakers. The Inquisitor was right. You do have their eyes. Those silver flecks. Disgusting. Soraya was dragged from the transport and through the arena's bowels, a maze of cells, preparation chambers, and execution staging areas. The walls were stained with centuries of blood, and the air reeked of fear and death. Other prisoners awaited their fate in cramped cells, some praying to forgotten gods, others sharpening makeshift weapons they'd somehow acquired. Her cell was smaller than the others, clearly meant for someone expected to die quickly. A thin mattress lay on the stone floor, and a single barred window looked out onto the arena's central pit. Even now, maintenance crews were preparing tomorrow's obstacle-spinning blade wheels. Acid pits and cages containing creatures that howled with inhuman voices as night fell over Zareth Prime. Soraya lay on her mattress and stared at the ceiling. Tomorrow, she would walk into that arena and almost certainly die. The Empire wanted to make an example of her, to show what happened to those who carried Forbidden's blood. But as she drifted toward sleep, something stirred deep within her, a warmth that had nothing to do with the stifling air. For just a moment, the silver flecks in her eyes seemed to glow in the darkness, and she heard what sounded like a whispered voice, speaking in a language she didn't recognize, but somehow understood. You are more than they know. More than you know. Asterisk. The morning sun cast long shadows across the arena floor as Saraya was led through the gladiators' entrance. The roar of the crowd hit her like a physical force, 500,000 voices united in their thirst for blood. She squinted against the bright light, her eyes adjusting to reveal the massive amphitheater in all its terrifying glory. The arena floor stretched before her, a circular pit nearly 200 meters across. The sand had been freshly raked, but dark stains beneath betrayed the countless deaths that had occurred here. Towering walls rose on all sides, topped with energy barriers that prevented any escape. Above, in golden balconies, the imperial nobility sat in their finery, pointing and laughing at the condemned girl below. Emperor Valerius himself occupied the highest box, his cybernetic enhancements glinting in the sunlight. Beside him sat Inquisitor Malachar, the man who had condemned her. His pale face showed no emotion as he watched her emergence, but Saraya could see the anticipation in his cold eyes. Citizens of Zareth Prime, boomed the arena's announcer, his voice amplified by speakers throughout the Colosseum. Today we witness the cleansing of alien filth from our pure bloodlines. Behold Saraya Vel, bearer of the Forbidden's Nephilim gene. The crowd's response was deafening. They threw refuse and bottles toward the arena floor, their faces twisted with hatred for something they didn't understand. Saraya stood in the center of the pit, unarmed and wearing only a simple tunic, while around the perimeter, gate mechanisms began to activate. For her first trial, the announcer continued, the condemned will face 3 Zareth Ravagers genetically enhanced predators, bred specifically for the arena. The gates slammed open, and 3 massive creatures bounded onto the sand. They stood, nearly 3 meters tall, their bodies a horrifying fusion of reptilian and mammalian features. Razor-sharp claws extended from their forelimbs, and their mouths opened to reveal rows of serrated teeth. They'd been starved for days, and their eyes held the maddened hunger of creatures driven beyond reason. The crowd fell silent with anticipation. This was the moment they'd all come to see, the helpless girl torn apart by monsters. But as the Ravagers circled her, something extraordinary happened. The warmth Saraya had felt in her cell the night before began to spread through her body, and the silver flecks in her eyes started to glow with an inner light. The whispered voice she'd heard returned, stronger now, speaking words that seemed to bypass her ears and speak directly to her soul. Remember what you are. Remember what they feared. The first Ravager lunged, its claws aimed at her throat. Time seemed to slow as Saraya moved not with the desperate panic of a cornered animal, but with fluid grace that defied explanation. She sidestepped the attack, her hand shooting out to strike the creature's neck with surgical precision. The impact sent the massive beast stumbling, and for the first time in its engineered life, it felt something it had never experienced. Fear. The crowd gasped. This wasn't how these executions were supposed to go. The second Ravager attacked from behind, but Saraya spun with inhuman speed, her eyes now blazing with silver light. She caught the creature's forearm as it swung at her, and with strength. That should have been impossible for someone her size. She twisted. The sound of breaking bone echoed through the arena, and the Ravager's roar of pain sent chills through the watching nobles. Impossible, whispered Inquisitor Malachar, leaning forward in his seat. The genetic markers were minimal. She shouldn't be able to. The third Ravager, the largest and most aggressive, charged with desperate fury. But Saraya was no longer the frightened girl who had been dragged from the transport. Something ancient and powerful had awakened within. Her and the arena floor had become her stage. She moved like liquid shadow, avoiding the creature's attacks while delivering precise strikes that brought it to its knees. The crowd watched in stunned silence as this slip of a girl systematically dismantled 3 of the arena's most feared predators without breaking a sweat. When the final ravager fell, Soraya stood alone in the center of the pit, her breathing steady, her silver eyes scanning the shocked faces in the stands. Blood stained her tunic, but none of it was hers. The sand around her was churned and red with the defeat of creatures that were supposed to be her executioners. The arena fell into absolute silence. Even the emperor had risen from his throne, his face a mask of disbelief and growing concern. Soraya looked up at the imperial box, her gaze meeting Malaker's. Then, slowly and deliberately, she knelt not in submission, but in a gesture so loaded with defiance that it sent a chill through every noble in attendance. It was the formal challenge pose of the ancient Nephilim, a gesture that said, "I acknowledge your authority, but I do not accept your judgment." The crowd erupted into chaos. Some cheered, caught up in the spectacle of the impossible. Others screamed in fear and rage. But in the imperial box, Emperor Valeris sat down heavily, his cybernetic fingers drumming against his throne's armrest. Malaker, he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of centuries of absolute power. What exactly did you bring to my arena? The Inquisitor had no answer. He could only stare at the girl below, watching as she rose from her kneel and walked calmly toward the exit gate, not as a condemned prisoner, but as a gladiator who had just earned her first victory. 3 weeks had passed since Soraya's first trial, and the arena had become her domain. What was meant to be a swift execution had transformed into something far more dangerous, a symbol of resistance that drew crowds from across the empire. The betting houses couldn't keep up with the demand for wagers on her matches, and her name was whispered in taverns and slave quarters throughout Zareth Prime. She stood now in the gladiator preparation chambers, no longer the frightened girl who had arrived in chains. Her body had grown lean and muscular, her movements carrying the confidence of someone who had stared death in the face and emerged victorious. The silver flecks in her eyes had become more pronounced, and sometimes, when the light hit them just right, they seemed to glow with their own inner fire. "Another victory," said Marcus Dane, the arena's chief gladiator trainer, as he bandaged a cut on her shoulder. "That's 23 consecutive wins. The crowd's starting to chant your name instead of calling for your death." Soraya flexed her fingers, feeling the power that now flowed through her veins like liquid lightning. Each battle had awakened more of whatever slept in her blood, and with it came knowledge fighting techniques, strategic thinking, and an understanding of combat that seemed to come from some ancestral memory. "The Emperor grows nervous," Marcus continued, lowering his voice. "Word is he's planning something special for your next match. Something that's supposed to end this ... inconvenience." Through the chamber's small window, Soraya could see the arena floor being prepared for the day's events. But today's setup was different, more elaborate, more deadly. Mechanical obstacles rose from the sand, their surfaces gleaming with energy fields and spinning blades. In the center, a raised platform had been constructed, surrounded by a moat of acid. "The Gauntlet of Severance," Marcus explained, following her gaze. "It's only been used 3 times in the arena's history. No one has ever survived it." Soraya nodded, unsurprised. She had known this day would come. The Empire couldn't allow her to continue winning indefinitely. Each victory made her more dangerous, not just as a fighter, but as a symbol. Slaves and citizens alike were beginning to look at her and see possibility instead of just another condemned prisoner. The door to the chamber opened, and a figure stepped inside, tall, elegant, with the bearing of nobility. Lady Lyanna Thorne, sister to the Emperor and one of the most powerful figures in the empire. Her auburn hair was pulled back in an elaborate style, and her green eyes held an intelligence that had made her enemies disappear without a trace. "Leave us," she commanded Marcus, who bowed and quickly exited. Lady Lyanna studied Soraya with the same clinical interest she might show a particularly fascinating specimen. "You're not what I expected," she said finally. "The reports described a savage, something barely human. Instead, I find a young woman who fights with the precision of a master and the wisdom of someone twice her age." "You're here to offer me something," Soraya replied, not bothering with the usual deference shown to imperial nobility. "Otherwise, you'd have let your brother's spectacle play out." A smile played at the corners of Lyanna's mouth. "Perceptive. Yes, I have a proposition. Join me. Become my champion, and I'll ensure your survival. You'll have luxury, comfort, and the chance to fight worthy opponents rather than being fed to increasingly desperate death traps. In exchange for what? Your loyalty. Your power. There are forces moving within the Empire, Soraya. Changes coming that will reshape everything. Someone with your unique abilities could find themselves in a position of considerable influence." Soraya was quiet for a long moment, considering. The offer was tempting survival, comfort, and the chance to fight as something other than a condemned prisoner. But she had learned something about herself in these past weeks, something that went beyond the awakening power in her blood. "I've spent my life serving others," she said finally. "Mining overseers, imperial guards, arena masters. Each one promised me that obedience would bring reward. But the only reward I ever received was another master." Lady Lyanna's expression didn't change, but Soraya could see the disappointment in her eyes. "Then you choose to face the gauntlet?" "I choose to face whatever comes. But I won't kneel to another master, no matter how gilded the chains." The lady nodded slowly. "I expected as much. You have the pride of your ancestors. It's written in your very bones." "Very well. But know this, Soraya Vel, if you survive today, you'll have made an enemy of the entire imperial family. There will be no more offers of mercy." As Lady Lyanna turned to leave, she paused at the door. "For what it's worth, I hope you survive. The Empire needs people like you, whether it knows it or not." Alone again, Soraya began her preparation ritual. She had developed this routine over the past week's meditation, stretching and focusing on the power that flowed through her. As she centered herself, she felt the familiar whisper of the ancestral voice. "Today, you will face your greatest test. But remember, you are not just fighting for your life. You are fighting for the future of all who suffer under the Empire's boot." The arena horns began to sound, calling her to what was meant to be her final battle. As she walked toward the entrance tunnel, Soraya smiled. They had created the Gauntlet of Severance to kill her, but they had forgotten one crucial detail. She was no longer the frightened girl they had condemned to die. She was becoming something else entirely. The crowd's roar was different today, electric with anticipation and dark with bloodlust. 500,000 spectators had packed the arena, and countless more watched from viewing screens throughout the Empire. This was to be the final act of the Soraya Vel spectacle, the moment when imperial power would reassert itself over the dangerous. Symbol she had become, Soraya emerged from the tunnel to find the arena transformed into a mechanical nightmare. The Gauntlet of Severance stretched before her like a vision from a fevered dream, a series of interconnected platforms, bridges and obstacles, each designed to kill in a different spectacular way. Spinning blade wheels carved through the air. Energy fields crackled with lethal voltage, and jets of acid spray created shifting patterns of death across the course dot at the center of it all. Raised on a platform surrounded by a moat of bubbling acid stood a figure that made Soraya's blood run cold. It was humanoid, but clearly artificial, a combat android of Imperial design, its sleek black armor covering weapon systems that could level a city block. The Reaper Mark VII, the Empire's most advanced execution unit, citizens of Zareth Prime. The announcer's voice boomed across the arena. Today, we witness the final cleansing of alien corruption from our pure bloodlines. The condemned will face the gauntlet of severance, a trial that has claimed the lives of every challenger in its history. Emperor Valerius stood in his golden box, his cybernetic enhancements glinting as he raised his hand for silence. Let it be known throughout the Empire, his amplified voice carried to every corner of the arena, that defiance of imperial authority leads only to death. Let this creature's destruction serve as a warning to all who would challenge the natural order. The starting bell rang, and Saraya began her run. The first obstacle was a series of pressure plates that triggered spinning blade wheels. As she approached, the silver light in her eyes intensified, and time seemed to slow. She could see the patterns in the blade's rotation, the safe paths through the deadly maze. Her enhanced reflexes, honed by weeks of combat, carried her through with liquid grace. The crowd gasped as she cleared the first section without a scratch. This wasn't supposed to happen. The gauntlet was designed to kill within the first few obstacles. The second section featured walls that closed in from both sides, their surfaces covered in energy spikes that would electrocute anything they touched. Saraya studied the mechanism for a heartbeat, then began to run. But instead of trying to race through, she used the walls themselves as a path, her enhanced strength and agility allowing her to wall run above the deadly spikes dot in the Imperial box. Lady Liana leaned forward, her green eyes fixed on the figure below. "Magnificent," she whispered. "She's not just surviving, she's making it look easy." Inquisitor Malaker's pale face had gone ashen. The genetic markers were minimal, he muttered. This level of enhancement should be impossible with such limited Nephilim ancestry. "Perhaps," said a new voice, "your tests were inadequate." They turned to see Grand Admiral Zirian, the Empire's military commander, his scarred face impassive as he watched Saraya navigate the third obstacle, a series of platforms that rotated over pits of molten metal. "I've seen combat reports from the Nephilim Wars. This girl fights like them, not just with their abilities, but with their tactical awareness." The fourth obstacle was a corridor filled with laser grids that shifted in random patterns. Saraya paused at its entrance, and for a moment the crowd held its breath. Then she moved, flowing through the deadly light show like a dancer, her body twisting and bending in ways that seemed to defy physics. "She's not guessing," Admiral Zarian observed. "She's reading the patterns, predicting the shifts. That's not possible unless ... Unless what?" the Emperor demanded. "Unless she's accessing ancestral combat memories. The Nephilim were said to carry the experiences of their entire bloodline in their genetic code. If she's awakening that capability." The fifth and final obstacle was the acid moat surrounding the android's platform. Saraya stood at its edge, studying the bubbling liquid that would dissolve flesh from bone in seconds. The platform was too far to jump, even with her enhanced abilities. Then she smiled a cold, calculating expression that sent chills through the watching nobility. She reached down and grabbed one of the metal plates from the previous obstacle, hurling it into the acid. As it began to dissolve, she grabbed another, then another, using them as temporary stepping stones across the moat. A crowd erupted as she landed on the central platform, facing the Reaper Mark VII. The android's red optical sensors focused on her, and its weapon systems came online plasma cannons, micro-missile launchers, and energy blades that could cut through starship hull. "Scanning target," the android announced in its mechanical voice. "Threat level, maximum. Initiating termination protocol." The battle that followed was unlike anything the arena had ever seen. The Reaper moved with mechanical precision, its weapons, systems coordinating in patterns designed to overwhelm any opponent. But Soraya fought with something the android couldn't quantify: intuition, creativity, and the accumulated combat wisdom of an entire extinct species. She ducked plasma bolts, deflected micro-missiles with pieces of debris, and when the android deployed its energy blades, she met them with her bare hands, the power in her blood, creating a protective field that could parry even molecular cutting edges. The crowd watched in stunned silence as the girl who was supposed to die systematically dismantled the Empire's most advanced killing machine. When the android finally fell, its systems sparking and failing, Soraya stood alone on the platform, unmarked by the battle. She looked up at the Imperial box, her silver eyes blazing with power, and for the third time, she knelt not in submission, but in challenge. The gesture was clear to everyone who saw it. I have passed your test. What comes next? Emperor Valerius stared down at her, his face a mask of rage and growing fear. In defeating the Gauntlet of Severance, Soraya had done more than survive. She had shown the Empire that there were forces it couldn't control, powers it couldn't contain. And in that moment, the whispers began, not just in the arena, but throughout the Empire. The girl who was meant to die had become something far more dangerous than a gladiator. She had become a legend. Part 5. The Throne of Defiance. 6 months had passed since the Gauntlet of Severance, and the Empire trembled. What had begun as a simple execution had become a revolution that spread across dozens of star systems. Soraya Vel's name was spoken in whispers on slave worlds, chanted in rebel strongholds, and cursed in the halls of imperial power. She stood now in the arena's command center, a room that had once been reserved for the Emperor's personal use during special events. Maps of the Empire covered the walls, marked with red indicators showing worlds in open rebellion. Communications equipment hummed with messages from resistance cells across the galaxy, all seeking guidance from the woman who had turned the Empire's greatest symbol of oppression into a beacon of hope. The Outer Rim colonies have declared independence, reported Commander Jacques Corin, a former Imperial officer who had defected after witnessing Soraya's early victories. That's 12 systems now flying the Silver Star banner. The Silver Star Soraya's symbol, based on the light that blazed in her eyes during battle. It had become the flag of rebellion, painted on the hulls of stolen Imperial ships and carved into the walls of liberated prison worlds. What about the core worlds? Soraya asked, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had learned to command through trial by fire. Still loyal to the Emperor, but there are signs of unrest. The propaganda networks are working overtime to convince people that you're some kind of demon, but the footage from your matches speaks for itself. Soraya nodded, studying the tactical displays. The Empire was vast, its resources seemingly unlimited, but it was also rigid and dependent on fear to maintain control. Each world that threw off Imperial rule weakened that control, showed others that resistance was possible. "Ma'am," called out Lieutenant Sarah Chun, a young woman who had once been a data analyst in the Imperial Intelligence Service. "Priority. Transmission from Zareth Prime. It's the Emperor himself." The main display screen flickered to life, revealing Emperor Valerius in his throne room. His cybernetic enhancements were more pronounced than before, suggesting recent upgrades to his combat systems. Behind him stood the surviving members of the Imperial Council, their faces masks of barely controlled hatred. "Soraya Vel," the Emperor's voice carried across the void, cold and precise. "You have become a cancer that threatens the natural order of the galaxy. Your rebellion ends now, does it?" Soraya replied, stepping into view of the camera. She wore simple combat gear, her silver eyes gleaming with the power that had made her a legend. "Because from where I stand, it looks like your empire is the one that's dying." The Emperor's face twisted with rage. "You forget yourself, slave. I am the rightful ruler of this galaxy, ordained by destiny to bring order to chaos. You are nothing but a genetic aberration, a throwback to a species that was rightfully exterminated." "The Nephilim weren't exterminated," Sariah said quietly. "They were murdered. An entire species wiped out because they refused to bow to your ancestors' tyranny. But you didn't get all of them, did you?" She gestured to the tactical displays around. Every world that throws off your rule, every slave that breaks their chains, every soldier that defects to fight for freedom, they're all proof that the Nephilim spirit lives on. Not just in my blood, but in the hearts of everyone who refuses to accept oppression. Enough. Valerius slammed his cybernetic fist against his throne's armrest. "I challenge you to single combat, aberration. Face me in the arena where this all began, and we'll settle this like the ancients did. Winner takes all." The command center fell silent. Everyone knew this was a trap. The Emperor wouldn't issue such a challenge unless he was confident in his victory. His cybernetic enhancements were legendary, his combat skills honed by centuries of experience. But Sariah smiled, and for a moment her silver eyes blazed with the combined wisdom of all her ancestors. "I accept, but not as your subject facing imperial justice. As an equal, settling the question of who has the right to rule." "You dare," the Emperor began. "I dare everything," Sariah interrupted. 7 days from now, in the arena where you meant to kill me, the Empire will watch, and they'll see which of us truly has the right to sit on the throne." The transmission ended, leaving the command center in stunned silence. Everyone knew what this meant, not just a fight to the death, but a symbolic battle for the future of the galaxy. "Are you sure about this?" Commander Corrin asked. "The Emperor's been enhanced beyond normal human limits. He survived assassination attempts that would have killed a dozen ordinary men." "I'm sure," Sariah replied, her voice carrying absolute conviction. This was always going to end this way. The Empire was built on the idea that some people are born to rule and others to serve. That lie has to be destroyed, and the only way to do that is to face its greatest champion. Over the following days, the galaxy held its breath. Imperial forces and rebel fleets alike took positions around Zareth Prime, preparing for whatever would come after the duel. The arena was hastily prepared, its floor cleared of obstacles to create a simple circle of sand, where two figures would determine the fate of billions. As the final day dawned, Sariah stood alone in her old cell, the same chamber where she had spent her first night as a condemned prisoner. The silver light in her eyes had grown stronger, and when she looked in the mirror, she could see the faces of her ancestors reflected behind her own. Generations of Nephilim who had fought and died for the right to live free. Today whispered. The ancestral voice, "You fight not just for yourself, but for all who will come after. Show them that the age of empires is ending, and the age of freedom has begun." The arena horns began to sound, calling her to face the Emperor in the same pit where her legend had been born. As she walked toward the tunnel that would lead her to either victory or death, Sariah smiled. The Empire had meant to kill her in this arena. Instead, she had turned it into the foundation of a new world. Now it was time to claim her throne. Asterisk.